What's up, guys? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. So Apple's new operating system and the new iPhone 5 has Apple fans geeking out. Some of the newest upgrades deal with security. There's an activation lock that requires an ID and password before a thief has a chance to turn off the Find My Phone security feature. And the new iPhones even host a fingerprint reader. Biometrics for the win. Now, iPhone theft or Apple picking is so prevalent, it's causing an uptick in crime in big cities. Which brings us to the Big Apple. See, the NYPD has been busy on the streets of New York. Cops are actually promoting the new security features as if they're Apple's new spokespeople. We're talking memos to families, tweets, even handing out flyers on street corners. Yes, I'm sure New Yorkers are thrilled that their tax dollars are going towards cops moonlighting as Apple geniuses. But before everyone goes and scoops up the latest iPhone, there's already been a major security breach. Just 2 days after the new phones went on sale, a German group of hackers managed to breach the fingerprint reader. According to the Chaos Computer Club, after the phone recognizes the user's fingerprint, you can place a piece of latex over another finger, and the phone will unlock. Oops, so much for biometrics. But I'm sure this little detail won't stop the NYPD from relying on a massive corporation to help them do its job. Last week, the House voted to cut $40 billion from the federal food stamp program over the next decade. This move would be devastating for the 1 in 7 Americans currently on food stamps. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that in 2014 alone, it would deprive 4 million Americans of this vital source of help. So once again, those struggling to make ends meet are the first to be targeted by lawmakers looking to slash an out-of-control deficit. But amidst the arguments to cut such programs like Meals on Wheels, special education, and food stamps, there seems to be very little discussion to slash this country's most fiscally bloated industry of all. Of course, I'm talking about the American military machine, an out-of-control beast that's propagated by U.S. tax dollars. So to discuss how Americans can stop financially supporting the military-industrial complex, I'm joined now by Ed Hedeman, founder of the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee and author of the book War Tax Resistance, a guide to withholding your support from the military. Ed, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Abby, for having me.
So, Ed, your organization features a pie chart that shows that 47% of the estimated 2014 federal budget will be spent on military expenditures. Yet the government breakdown only shows 24% going towards defense. Why the discrepancy here, and how did you arrive at these numbers?
Well, the discrepancy is that this is of federal funds. The government's figure usually includes trust funds like Social Security, but trust funds like Social Security are raised separately and spent separately. What we look at are the federal funds which are raised from the federal income tax on someone's 1040 form and then spent depending on how Congress allocates them. We also include the cost of past wars, because if the government borrows money for its war spending, then the payment of that is put off to the future, and so we include that, not just the current military spending.
I wanted to see if you could break down what specific taxes that we pay for go toward military spending.
Well, the main one is the federal income tax that you pay on your 1040 form. When you fill out your 1040 form, on the back of the form there's a line that says federal tax. That's what I'm talking about and what we consider a war tax. It doesn't specifically go to war. It goes to a lot of things, but war military spending is a large part of it. There's also a separate line further down on the 1040 form that is Social Security. We're not looking at that. It's the federal income tax line that is the one that we consider the primary war tax.
And Ed, you mentioned past wars, and I think this is a really important point to explore right now. People often think of wars as just a snapshot in time. They're initiated and then they're over, but in fact the cost for a single war can last centuries. I wanted you to break down how much we're paying for past wars.
Well, the past war portion includes veterans' benefits, but a large part of that past war is the interest on the national debt. We're still paying off expenses not only for the Vietnam War and World War II, but also previous wars, probably all the way going back to the Civil War. Not a lot of money, but the Civil War is a huge expenditure. It was never really paid off, and we continue to pay interest on that. But mostly it's the recent military spending, as well as the past war expenditures going, well, at least back to World War II in significant portion. But I'd say about 20% of the budget is that. I don't have the pie chart in front of me, but as I recall, it's about that amount.
Well, indeed, we are paying still for the Civil War. I wanted to pull up that headline right now. Very shocking indeed. I didn't realize that until today. You know, why is this issue completely unaddressed, it seems, in the halls of Congress when they're talking about the deficit, when they're addressing launching new wars of aggression, that we're still paying for the Civil War? I mean, it just seems to be completely omitted from the discussion here of how much these cost.
Yeah, well, I think that it's just an unpopular thing to mention that we're still paying off old wars. So the Americans and Congress certainly don't like debts. They don't like the concept of debts, and so I'd rather forget about them, just think about current military and other expenditures. So, but I can't read the minds of people in Congress, but that's my guess.
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, it's definitely unpopular to talk about that. I think it's also unpopular to talk about how much veterans' payouts are for decades and decades. Let's talk about kind of the arguments against this. You know, playing devil's advocate here for a little bit. The DoD employs 3.2 million people, more than the entire Chinese military. What do you say to people who argue that reducing military spending will hurt jobs in the economy?
No, I think it would actually improve jobs in the economy because military spending is capital intensive. If these people were employed doing other things like teaching in schools, healthcare, that would employ even more people than military spending because the military builds a lot of weapons that it doesn't intend to use in theory. But if we build schools, we certainly expect to use them, or hospitals. And so that money, I don't want to see anybody who's in the military put out of work. I just want them to see them working for some other fields, like you know, the doctors, hospitals, teachers, so forth.
Right, not death and destruction.
Right, exactly.
What about veterans? Because yes, I mean, it's you know, you're talking about halting the spending for wars right now, but you know, it's undoubtable that veterans need to receive benefits for past wars that they were in. Do you think that they shouldn't receive a portion of federal taxes because technically that's also part of war spending, obviously?
No, they should receive medical benefits, but everybody should. It shouldn't be. People shouldn't expect medical benefits from the government just because they're a veteran. I think that everybody is entitled to get medical benefits, whether they're a veteran or not. So I would do away with the Veterans Administration if I had that sort of power, which I don't, and have a different kind of system where everybody gets at least as good, if not better, probably, hopefully better care than what the Veterans Administration gives to veterans.
Well, let's talk about your organization, Ed. What is it all about, and how can people engage in resistance?
Well, a lot of us are dissatisfied with just writing Congress and the president saying cut military spending. So what we advocate is direct action. People refusing to pay their taxes directly to the IRS, to the Pentagon, to the military, and we suggest that people might want to consider refusing to pay the taxes. For example, you could fill out your 1040 form and just not send the check to the IRS. You can, in fact, send it to some other agency, non-governmental agency, or some community programs. So what I've done in the years that I've refused my taxes to the government, I've taken that money, it's about $80,000 now over a 40-year period, and rerouted it to other organizations. I've kept none of the money for myself, and I've given it away because I consider them taxes, but I don't want it to go to the government.
Well, I mean, what do you tell people who say, you know, I want to do this, I'm scared of the IRS, I'm scared that I'll go to jail? Yeah,
well, if they want to go to jail, that's going to be a tough way to do it, because people who, on principle, refuse to pay openly their taxes, say that they just don't want to spend it, have their money and their taxes spent on the military, are very unlikely to go to jail. It doesn't mean it can't happen and it won't happen. It has happened. In the 70 years or so of the modern war tax resistance movement, there have probably been 30 or 35 people who have been jailed because of some form of tax resistance. Normally it's because they won't give information to the IRS. It's not because they haven't paid. There have been tens of thousands of people who have refused to pay taxes openly, and very few of them go to jail. What's more likely is that the government will look for a bank account or a salary and try to seize that money, but sending them to jail is highly unlikely.
And do you cite why you're doing this to the government? I mean, do they know what you're doing? Do you cite the reason why you're resisting?
Oh, absolutely. I file my, I mean, not everybody who's a war tax resistor does this, but I file my returns every year, fill it out normally, and I include a letter explaining why I'm not paying these taxes over to the government and telling them that I'm sending the taxes elsewhere, not to the government itself. And sometimes I'll even tell them where I'm sending the taxes. But I'm quite open with the government about, and the IRS, what I'm doing.
Well, we have about 30 seconds left, but can you give people some advice of how they can take part in this growing movement across the country?
Well, you have to first owe money, because if you are getting refunds back from the government, then there's no way you can resist it. So one way that some people do it is to try to get more allowances on their W-4 form that they file with their employer, such that at least they owe money at the end of the year. And then at that point, they can decide what they want to do with that, whether they want to send it to the government or refuse. But if you refuse $10, it's not a big deal. I mean, if there are 1,000 people refusing $10, I'd rather have that happen than one person refusing $10,000. The same amount of money, but the impact would be greater, and the government would have a hard time ignoring it.
Ed Hedemann, thank you so much, founder of the National War Tax Resisting Coordinating Committee.
Thank you.
You know the whole two-tiered justice system I keep talking about? Well, I'm about to tell you a story that epitomizes the definition of injustice. This happened a couple weeks ago, so I apologize for being the bearer of bad late news, but the story deserves the attention it's not getting from the corporate press. Last year, a lawsuit was filed against defense contractor CACI International. It was a class action suit brought by the torture victims of Abu Ghraib, who were seeking legal retribution against the defense contractor in part responsible for their torture. Well, instead of allowing the trial to take place, the men were barred from entering the U.S., and the lawsuit was outright dismissed by this guy, District Court Judge Gerald Bruce Lee. Why? Because he ruled that CACI was immune from prosecution since the alleged torture took place on foreign soil. And if that total lack of accountability for torture isn't bad enough, get this. CACI had the gall to then counter-sue the torture victims. Mind you, we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar defense industry counter-suing to cover their measly legal fees. Now, like me, many of you might be outright disgusted at the audacity of this company. But maybe you should direct your disgust at the U.S. justice system instead, because CACI won the case. Yep, earlier this month, those same torture victims were ordered to pay $14,000 in legal fees to the contractor. My question is, why did the court throw out the first lawsuit for lack of standing in the U.S., but award damages to CACI in the same court? Seems to me that Judge Lee only believes in freedom and justice for some. I want you to think back to 2004 when the Abu Ghraib torture scandal first broke out. Remember the photographs that surfaced revealing the horrible torture tactics inflicted against detainees? Prisoners were hooded and told to stand on platforms for hours hooked to wires. They were told that if they moved, they'd be electrocuted. They're stripped naked and sexually abused with dehumanizing tactics such as smearing feces and menstrual blood on their faces and forcing them to commit homosexual acts. Other tactics included dragging their genitals across a freezing, wet concrete floor and burning them with cigarettes. This is the tarnished legacy of Abu Ghraib, a cancer that clearly persists today. These innocent victims were humiliated, tortured, and killed. And now they owe the criminals that did this to them. I guess I shouldn't be shocked anymore. After all, a Nobel Peace Prize winner has launched more wars than I can count. Whistleblowers have been deemed traitors. Apparently now a court can rule that those that are tortured at the hands of this government and its mercenaries will be indebted to their torturers. It'd be easy to pin the blame on CACI for the torture itself, but I'm talking about the two-tiered justice system here. And the force that embodies the true definition of that injustice is Judge Gerald Lee. Still ahead, Syria has agreed to hand over its chemical weapons, but what about Israel? We'll talk to political activist Ken O'Keefe next.
I know CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News have taken some knocks lately, but the fact is I admire their commitment to cover all sides of a story, just in case one of them happens to be accurate.
That was funny, but it's closer to the truth than you might think. Excellent. Because when politicians and the mainstream media work side by side, the joke is actually on you. At RT News, we have a different approach. LOL. Because the news of the world just is not this funny.
I'm not laughing, damn it, I'm not laughing!
You guys stick to the jokes, we'll handle the news.
After a seemingly imminent U.S. military strike on Syria, there's been one last-ditch effort by world leaders to find a diplomatic solution to the crisis, for Syria to give up its chemical weapons arsenal by mid-2014. And just last week, the country met its first deadline to release a full inventory of its chemical weaponry. Earlier this month, Syria signed on to the Chemical Weapons Convention, which prohibits the development, production, stockpiling, and use of chemical weapons. It's a step that many in the world are applauding. However, the elephant in the room is another country in the region that has used chemical weapons but has not yet ratified that convention: Israel. Earlier, I spoke to Ken O'Keefe, prominent anti-war activist, political analyst, and former U.S. Marine. I first asked him why there's been no pressure at all on Israel to ratify this treaty.
Israel enjoys the favor of the court systems, the mainstream media, the governments of the world, and primarily the Western governments. And ultimately, this is how they can get away with bloody murder, because it's beyond hypocrisy now, isn't it? And if any nation should be involved in disarming, it isn't even Israel, number one. It should be the United States. Nobody is using weapons of mass destruction more than the United States, and yet it's involved in disarming another nation. This is, for me, beyond hypocrisy.
Well, we're seeing this diplomatic push regarding Syria right now, of course, at the behest of world leaders kind of forcing it. But we've seen an attempt at diplomacy before in Iraq, Ken. Back in 2003, Saddam was actually complying with UN weapons inspectors before Bush pushed him out, halted the diplomatic process, and before they were even finished with the job. I mean, do you see the potential for this type of scenario playing out in Syria as well?
It is definitely very possible. You know, Scott Ritter, who was one of the chief weapons inspectors during that period, stated very clearly before the invasion that there was absolutely no chance whatsoever that Saddam Hussein had any kind of reasonable or dangerous level of weapons of mass destruction or chemical weapons. Despite all of this, the bombardment of propaganda was such to get the facade of consent, at least within certain segments of the population. And ultimately, we had this horrendous invasion, which now is responsible for the death of, I think, probably closer to 2 million, but certainly 1 million. And a country literally destroyed, millions of refugees, millions of orphans. And this very same scenario could play out with Syria. In fact, we have to be very aware of the fact that, well, I think Russia is doing the right thing right now and saying they're being blackmailed. The foreign minister has said just today, I believe, that the U.S. is trying to blackmail them into signing an agreement that basically says virtually anything that the Syrians do could be construed as a breach of the agreement, and bam, the bombs will start dropping. So we cannot allow this to happen.
As you mentioned before, kind of that extreme hypocrisy where the U.S. is declaring moral authority to actually preemptively attack nations that might be a threat in the future just because they have these chemical weapons or nuclear weapons. Do you think that countries like Syria, North Korea, and Iran have the right to arm themselves with chemical and nuclear weapons against threatening hegemonic forces?
Well, if there's any one lesson that Iraq taught us, it's very clear that if you disarm, you have no protection whatsoever. And we look to North Korea. Why have we not picked a fight with North Korea? And to me, this is really at the root of who we are as a culture and a society. We're actually the biggest cowards. We're the proverbial bully. The bully doesn't pick on someone bigger than him, somebody who can fight back. The bully always picks on somebody weaker. The bully is a coward, quite frankly. And the only nations that can defend themselves against this bully are those that can arm themselves. I'm completely against weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons. I find it an indictment of humanity as being collectively insane that we have allowed the kind of weapon production that has occurred over the last decades. But the reality is the reality, and if we've taught the rest of the world anything, it is that they should get themselves a bomb rather quickly if they want to try and defend themselves against the empire, the aggressor, which is killing people en masse. This is why the first nation to disarm should be the United States and Israel and Britain and the other major weapons producers.
You served in the Gulf War as a U.S. Marine. Let's take it back a little bit and kind of find out how you got to where you are. In 2001, you attempted to renounce your U.S. citizenship. How did that evolution from being a Marine, serving, going to that come about?
I had an experience in the Marine Corps where I was being punished for speaking out about something, and it radically transformed me. It made me start to question things that before I hadn't questioned. If I was wrong about the Marine Corps, what else might I be wrong about? And as I studied history, I realized that my nation had been involved in so many horrendous activities that were anything but geared towards justice and freedom and democracy. And as I learned more, I realized that, you know what, I actually understand citizenship for what it is. It's a social contract between the individual, the citizen, and the government, the nation. And I don't agree to the contract. I do not agree with paying into a tax system that's being used to murder my brothers and sisters halfway around the world based on a pack of lies. I don't agree with committing crimes against humanity, against my fellow human beings, using depleted uranium, using white phosphorus, dropping millions of gallons of Agent Orange on people. This is all insanity, and I want my name taken off that list. Ultimately, the United States takes the position that that we don't have that right, that I don't have the right to determine who I am politically, even though I've left the country 12 years ago. I don't pay taxes in the United States. I don't vote in the United States. They claim me as their property and think that I'm a U.S. citizen. So this actually gets to a deeper issue. Do we as human beings have the right to self-determination? Does the government determine my political status, or do I?
Good point. And you even went to Iraq in 2003 during the initial invasion. I thought this was really fascinating, leading the Human Shield movement against coalition forces. Why is this type of drastic action necessary?
Well, the real reason why that strategy is still viable, in my opinion, is that there is a sick and twisted reality of the way we value life on this planet. White Western lives are not valued the same way that dark-skinned lives, African lives, Iraqi lives, Arab lives, they just simply don't count. Again, we've killed 1 million to 2 million people in Iraq. We haven't even so much as apologized for that. Yet we're going to hear about the 3,000 Westerners, primarily Westerners, who died on 9/11 till the end of time. What this tells us is that obviously we don't value life equally. If we did, the United States would be considered the biggest criminal on the planet, and those that were leading this country would be guilty and put in prison for the rest of their lives. But of course, we don't value life correctly. So the Human Shield strategy is based on this injustice, this inequality. If our lives are so valuable, then some of us should be willing to put our lives on the line in order to defend those who don't have the ability to defend themselves.
You mentioned the fact that the U.S. government has not apologized for the deaths of over 1 million Iraqis. I mean, but the truth is, Ken, we haven't even heard that confirmed. I mean, I still hear 100,000 dead in Iraq still perpetuated in the mainstream media. It's absurd. Extensive studies proving that over 1 million have died. And this really goes along with that whole perpetuation of the war on terror narrative, the rhetoric we hear to kind of lambaste us with 9/11, kind of traumatize us over and over again about the myth of al-Qaeda proliferating in the world. And I think that if people question anything, they're labeled anti-American. I mean, Ken, how did we get to a point where people simply questioning anything about the government are considered unpatriotic?
Yes, this is an interesting evolution. I mean, there was a time, you could argue, certainly when the Founding Fathers confronted the British Empire, although there's a lot to that story that we couldn't go into in detail now, but ultimately there was actually a form of patriotism. There was actually a real desire to be free, to be able to live your life without the tyranny, the yoke of injustice, the high taxes and all this sort of stuff. And somehow it seems that America is like the spoiled child that's been gifted with everything, gifted to the point that it takes everything for granted and believes it's entitled to everything without having to do anything for it. And this is the way we've been for generation after generation, to the point that we have sat by like the boiling frog with the temperature being raised little by little, to the point that now the pot is boiling and we better act fast or it is going to be the end of us. And I think, you know, about the U.S. Constitution, I've got it behind me, the Oath Keepers. I'm holding out real hope that the people in the United States military and also in the police forces and others who have taken an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States are going to take that seriously. Because if you're not taking that oath seriously, you're anything but a patriot. In my mind, you're a traitor. And actually, I knew the Constitution. And although I have been adamantly opposed to U.S. policy, I actually still believe in the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And every red-blooded American patriot should be not only believing in it, but fighting for it.
Isn't it fascinating, Ken, how we've gone a complete 180 in this Orwellian world that we live in, where now knowing the Bill of Rights, knowing the Constitution actually deems you a potential threat by some forces of this government. And I wanted to bring your attention to this DOJ memo recently discovered by the Digital Journal. It instructs local police how to spot terrorist sleeper cells. The criteria includes such broad things as traveling to countries where militant Islam rules, having fury at the West's global policies, or believing in conspiracy theories about 9/11. Ken, how dangerous is this to implicate such a large section of the population?
It's completely and totally ridiculous. The world is literally upside down. We are in Orwell's 1984 on steroids, quite frankly. And ultimately, it's staring us in the face. It's not even that overt. It's pretty much right in your face. And again, this brings me back to what I was saying before about how we've been sort of like a spoilt child. You know, at some point you actually have to stand up and take responsibility for your lot in life, and the American people actually have established, and the world has largely established, who has the real power just recently when we look at Syria. The only reason, in my opinion, why we are not bombing Syria right now is because the facade of consent has not been obtained. And all we have to do, therefore, is be informed. And if they want to lie to us, if they want to try and intimidate us, it doesn't really matter if we don't buy into it. Because if they don't have our consent, they can't do a damn thing.
It's all about manufacturing consent. It's time to stand up to the empire, say no to new wars of aggression. Thank you so much, Ken O'Keefe, political activist, political analyst, former U.S. Marine. Guys, that's it for us tonight. Please come back and break the set with me all over again tomorrow.